Usually when we talk about analyzing a system, whether that's like a legal system, an economic framework, or even just a social structure, there's this built-in expectation of, well, mechanical objectivity.
Right. Like we want things to be measurable.
Exactly. Think about structural engineering, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're standing in front of a massive suspension bridge, you can physically see the mechanics at work. You see the stress points, the tension in the cables, the load-bearing steel beams.
Yeah, the physics of it are just entirely visible.
Right. And if that bridge collapses, an engineer doesn't look at the rubble and declare the bridge was evil.
No, of course not.
They just point to the debris and say, well, there's the structural failure. The tensile strength of that specific alloy was just insufficient for the sheer weight of the traffic.
It's a highly comforting way to view the world, honestly. I mean, we inherently want our institutions to operate under those exact same objective, visible rules of physics.
We really do.
We prefer to categorize societal failures like soaring divorce rates or a total collapse in birth rates as just, accidents of bureaucracy, or like simple inefficiencies that can be patched up with a new policy or slightly better blueprint.
But then you step out of the realm of concrete and steel, and you step into the world of modern family law, gender dynamics, institutional authority.
Yeah.
And suddenly that clean, objective engineering blueprint is completely on fire.
It's just ash.
We are looking at a landscape that, according to the source material we are unpacking today, isn't just experiencing a structural failure. It's actually functioning with, lethal, calculated precision.
Yeah.
It is actively hostile.
Which is a very heavy premise.
It is the explosive premise of the deep dive we're taking today. So to you, the listener, especially if you're someone who has been navigating the men's rights space, or if you're deeply familiar with the red pill community, or honestly, if you're just invested in understanding the historical trajectory of our modern institutions and how they reach this absolute boiling point, welcome.
This deep dive is definitely speaking directly to you.
It is. Now, before we get lost in the weeds here, I want to make sure you have the tools to follow along. So please hit that like button, subscribe to the show. And if you really want to see the unvarnished architecture of these arguments for yourself, I highly recommend heading over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now.
Yeah, you're going to want the source text for this one.
You definitely will. You want to pick up the digital ebook we are dissecting today. It's called Assets in Exile: Navigating the Systemic Legal Assault on Fatherhood and the Dark Night of the Modern Man by Conrad Riker.
Riker's work is, profound. And to say it's incredibly dense would be a massive understatement.
Yeah, it's heavy.
So let's establish our mission parameters right out of the gate for this conversation. We are unpacking a highly charged, entirely uncompromising 2026 manifesto. I mean, Riker wrote this book specifically for men who feel alienated, marginalized, and, in his exact words, actively hunted by the modern world.
Hunted.
Yeah. The text contains intense, politically charged critiques of feminism, of Marxism, and of the fundamental nature of the state itself.
Which means we need to be crystal clear with you, the listener, about our role here today. We are maintaining strict, unshakable neutrality.
Absolutely.
We aren't here to endorse Riker's viewpoints, nor are we here to validate them, debunk them, or offer some kind of moral critique. We are not taking a political side. Our job is to act strictly as your impartial expert guides.
We're basically mapping the terrain.
Exactly. We're going to map out exactly what Conrad Riker is arguing, examine the philosophical and legal architecture he uses to build those arguments, and try to understand why this specific manifesto is resonating so fiercely and so rapidly within the manosphere.
And the hook Riker uses to pull the reader in is just massive in its scope. He does not argue that the modern legal and cultural system is broken.
Right. He argues the exact opposite.
He claims it is working with terrifying perfection, operating exactly as it was designed to. He characterizes the current institutional landscape as and this is his term, a satanic hydra of Marxism and feminism that has deliberately, methodically captured our institutions.
And its primary, underlying function. According to him, it is to systematically extract wealth from men and fundamentally criminalize the biological and social role of fatherhood.
That is a staggering claim to make.
It really is. And what strikes me is that he doesn't just, throw out a term like satanic hydra as a cheap buzzword to get clicks. He spends chapters going deep into the ancient world to build the foundation for this case. To understand assets and exile, you really have to understand the toolkit Riker is bringing to the table here.
Yeah, he isn't just citing modern court cases.
Not at all.
His methodology is fascinating. He leans heavily on classical Western philosophy, specifically pulling frameworks from Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. He utilizes the psychological resilience of Stoicism.
Yeah?
But perhaps the most surprising and effective tool he uses throughout the whole book is etymology.
The history of words.
Exactly, the historical roots and the evolution of words themselves. He uses these disciplines to systematically deconstruct what he calls the gynocentric matrix.
So our goal for this deep dive is to give you a comprehensive understanding of the history of our modern institutions, strictly through Riker's eyes. We want to explore the exact mechanisms of how he believes they were captured by these ideologies, and outline the radical steps he insists men must take to reclaim their authority.
Right, and if we're starting with his toolkit, we have to start exactly where Riker starts, which is with language.
I found this part incredibly compelling. Riker argues that the war on traditional men isn't actually starting in the courtroom, and it doesn't start with economic policy either.
No, it starts in the dictionary.
It is primarily a grammatical and linguistic war. His premise is that before you can destroy a physical institution, you first have to completely redefine the words that describe it.
Because Riker posits that language is the absolute boundary of human reality. If you cannot name a concept, you can't defend it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right, so he dedicates a massive portion of his opening thesis to dissecting the word revolution.
Oh, this is wild.
Because in the modern West, we are conditioned from childhood to revere this word. We view revolution as the vanguard of progress, right? Like a bold, necessary march forward into a brighter, more equitable dawn.
But Riker breaks the word apart etymologically.
He does. He traces it back to the Latin revolvere, the prefix re meaning back or again, and volvere meaning to roll.
To literally roll backward.
To roll backward, to unroll, to revert. Riker highlights the profound irony here. Every modern left-wing revolution, which explicitly claims to be about forward motion and linear progress, literally means regression in its own etymological grammar.
Wow.
And he supplements this with the Greek philosophical term allogon, which translates to that which is contrary to reason, or the irrational.
So he's arguing that the ideological revolutionary can't even name his own political project without inherently contradicting himself.
Precisely. In Riker's framework, revolution is purely parasitic. It never builds cathedrals, it doesn't author brilliant legal codes, and it doesn't create infrastructure. It only exists to roll back the order and stability that masculine energy previously built.
Which introduces us to that deeply visceral metaphor he uses, the Satanic Hydra. I want to understand how he connects this concept of linguistic, rolling back to the specific enemies he identifies. Because he breaks this Hydra down into three distinct cooperating heads. You have Marxism, feminism, and a broader cultural atmosphere.
And Riker views these not as separate movements at all, but as highly synergistic components of the exact same beast. In his analysis, Marxism provided the theoretical and economic scaffolding necessary to target and destroy the patriarchal family.
The pure Marxist economic theory, like debates about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, it's too dry.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't inspire the visceral, burning passion required for a full cultural takeover. It needs a psychological vehicle to actually gain mass traction.
And that is where Riker claims the second head of the Hydra, feminism, enters the equation.
Right. He argues that feminism successfully weaponized female resentment and inherent solipsism, basically turning interpersonal grievances into a massive political movement, a movement that can be relied upon to constantly vote for the expansion of state power.
Okay, I want to push back slightly on that, or at least ask for a little clarification, because when he brings in the third head, the broader culture, he leans heavily on Herbert Marcuse and this idea of repressive tolerance.
Yes.
But tolerance, by definition, implies allowing things you disagree with.
Yeah.
So how does Riker square that circle? Like, how can tolerance be repressive?
That paradox is the exact mechanism of the third head. Riker spends a lot of time on Herbert Marcuse, who was a prominent Marxist intellectual of the Frankfurt School, writing back in 1965.
Okay.
Marcuse published an essay literally titled Repressive Tolerance. In it, he argued that to achieve true utopian liberation, a society must actually become intensely, violently intolerant of any right-wing, traditional, or conservative movements, while simultaneously being boundlessly tolerant of left-wing subversion and radicalism.
And Riker maps this directly onto the modern manosphere.
He does. He argues this concept of repressive tolerance is applied today to systematically silence and pathologize male dissent. It has just become the invisible ideological air we breathe. It makes it socially unacceptable and sometimes professionally fatal to even question the dismantling of traditional masculinity.
So under Marcuse's framework, if a man stands up and advocates for the traditional nuclear family, the culture is taught to view that not as a differing opinion to be tolerated, but as an act of oppression that must be silenced in the name of liberation.
Exactly. That's the repressive part.
That is wild. And this is where Riker moves from just analyzing words to actively reclaiming them. He does this so powerfully with the word dominion from Genesis 1.26.
Oh, yeah.
If you read modern sociological critiques, dominion is almost universally framed as a synonym for tyranny. It's framed as the patriarchal excuse men use to oppress women and exploit the earth.
And Riker attacks that modern interpretation head-on. He traces the etymology and the ancient theology of the word, specifically the Hebrew word rada. Riker asserts that rada does not translate to tyranny or brute exploitation. It is a royal and priestly mandate for stewardship. To hold dominion is to cultivate, to guard, carefully manage, and keep the estate flourishing.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. He views the modern feminist framing of dominion as oppression, as a highly deliberate Marxist linguistic attack, one designed to sever men from their divine historical commission to protect and build. And he applies this exact same historical rigor to the word pater, the Latin root for father.
This was a light bulb moment for me reading the text. Riker makes it very clear that the ancient understanding of pater goes so far beyond just being a biological sperm donor.
The divergence between the ancient meaning and the modern application is vast. The Proto-Indo-European root of the word traitor carries a deep foundational connotation of nourishment, physical protection, and upholding a structure. Riker literally calls the father the load-bearing wall of the household. So he argues, when the modern legal system reduces a biological father to a weekend visitor who gets alternate Saturdays and is mandated to pay a monthly fee, the state hasn't just redefined a word, they have committed an act of civilizational vandalism.
Civilizational vandalism. It makes me think of an analogy. Riker's basically saying that these cultural Marxists haven't just hacked the software of society.
Right.
They've actually gone into the system and rewritten the dictionary itself, so the computer can't even recognize the original code anymore. If the operating system no longer has a definition for a load-bearing wall, it isn't going to trigger any alarms when you start knocking those walls down.
That analogy perfectly captures his thesis on language. If you delete the vocabulary of strength, protection, and stewardship, you delete the culture's ability to even conceptualize those virtues, let alone actually defend them.
Which leads me to wonder, how does Riker connect this foundational linguistic manipulation to his ideas about collective guilt? Because a major theme in Assets in Exile is how modern men are systematically made to feel guilty for things they haven't even done, or for simply possessing masculine traits. How does the linguistic war enable that?
Riker identifies collective guilt as the ultimate goal of rewriting the dictionary. He points out that classical Western jurisprudence, which is heavily influenced by Christian theology and Roman law, hinges entirely on individual moral responsibility.
You are judged by your specific actions, your intent.
Exactly. But he argues that the left uses broad, nebulous linguistic framing terms like toxic masculinity, patriarchal oppression, or systemic bias to completely bypass individual actions. Instead, they assign a collective inherited guilt to all men for the actions of a pathological few, or for the perceived historical sins of imaginary ancestors.
He goes so far as to call this process Marxist witchcraft, which is an incredibly loaded phrase.
He uses witchcraft very intentionally. In his view, by accepting these terms, by adopting an apologetic posture for historical crimes you didn't commit, or by apologizing for your innate biological drive to protect and provide, you are abandoning the logos.
The logos being the rational, objective order of the universe.
Right. You are submitting to an irrational spell, the witchcraft. You are agreeing to let the system judge you as an abstract, formless oppressor rather than a distinct individual.
And if you agree to be an abstract oppressor in the cultural dictionary, it's only a matter of time before the law treats you like one. This linguistic warfare isn't just a fun debate happening in university sociology departments.
No, not at all.
Riker claims this is fully operationalized and armed with the very real physical power of the state, which pulls us directly into the consequences of this linguistic shift. If the dictionary has been rewritten to make traditional fatherhood invisible or inherently oppressive, how does that actually look when a man steps into a courtroom? Because the vocabulary isn't just theory anymore, it becomes case law.
That transition from theory to operationalized state power is the core of his critique of the family court system, a system which he aggressively relabels as an administrative cartel.
A cartel?
Yes. Riker completely abandons the polite fiction that family court is a venue for justice, mediation, or conflict resolution. He treats it as a ruthless, highly optimized, revenue-generating machine And to prove how this machine was built, he takes the reader back to a very specific historical pivot point.
The year 1969 in California.
Exactly.
The moment Governor Ronald Reagan signed no-fault divorce into law, which, Riker must find deeply ironic given Reagan's conservative legacy.
Oh, the irony is definitely not lost on him. Riker uses 1969 as ground zero. Prior to this legislation, marriage in the Western legal tradition was understood as a binding covenant. Breaking that covenant required a legal demonstration of fault. Someone had to prove adultery, severe abuse, or total abandonment.
Right.
Riker argues that the stroke of a pen on no-fault divorce instantly, overnight, converted the sacred covenant of marriage into what he calls an unconscionable contract.
Let's break down that term, unconscionable contract. Because in standard contract law, if you and I sign an agreement for a business, and I break the contract just because I feel like it, I am the one liable. I pay the damages. Riker is pointing out a massive legal anomaly here.
You're hitting on the exact legal friction point Riker highlights. Under no-fault divorce, the legal standard is entirely inverted. Riker points out that suddenly, under this new legal framework, a man could be unilaterally expelled from his own property, entirely stripped of daily access to his children, and forced to fund the destruction of his own family through alimony and child support without ever breaking a single vow.
Wow.
The party who initiates the dissolution of the contract faces zero legal penalty and, in fact, is often financially incentivized by the courts to do so.
I want to pause on that because it is a profound and, frankly, disturbing reframing of how we view divorce. Usually society views a divorce as a tragedy of a relationship failing. It's two people who just couldn't make it work. Riker is saying, no, it's a systemic feature, not a bug. He essentially views the modern divorce industry as a state-sanctioned mechanism where the biological father is stripped of his humanity and treated merely as a disposable financial resource.
Yes.
But I have to ask, is this really a planned, calculated extraction? Or is it just a messy, poorly designed social welfare program that got out of hand? Like, how does he actually prove the cartel aspect?
Riker attempts to prove the cartel aspect by following the flow of money. He directs his focus specifically to Title 4BD of the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1975.
Okay, we need to really unpack Title 4D because this is where Riker makes his most explosive claim, that the state actually profits directly from fatherlessness. How does that mechanism physically work?
According to Riker's breakdown, Title 4VD creates a perverse, multi-billion-dollar incentive structure that fundamentally corrupts the judiciary. The mechanics are complex but crucial. Under this federal law, the government reimburses states for a significant portion of the administrative costs of running child support enforcement programs. But beyond just covering costs, the federal government also pays states incentive payments based on the sheer volume of child support they successfully collect and enforce.
Wait, hold on. The state gets federal bonus money based on how much child support it extracts.
That is Riker's core financial thesis. He argues that this creates a direct, mathematically measurable vested interest for the state to create single-mother households. Because a married two-parent household generates zero Title 4B federal matching funds.
Right.
But the moment you eject the father from the home and establish a child support order, that family becomes a revenue-generating unit for the state bureaucracy. This triggers federal funding, expands bureaucratic budgets, and justifies the hiring of more state employees.
So by legally ejecting the father, the court manufactures a dependent single mother, which allows the state to step in as this parasitic middleman, continually harvesting the man's labor under the guise of child welfare.
Riker formalizes this dynamic into a really bleak syllogism. The system is explicitly designed to transfer male resources to women without requiring any reciprocal female marital commitment, effectively making the state the ultimate proxy husband.
The proxy husband.
Right. The state provides the financial security that the traditional husband used to provide, but the state funds this by violently extracting those resources from the exiled husband. And he argues this extraction is enforced brutally, completely bypassing standard constitutional protections against debt peonage through mechanisms like the Bradley Amendment.
The Bradley Amendment. He refers to this as enforcing a system of unconstitutional male peonage. What exactly did the Bradley Amendment do?
Passed in 1986, the Bradley Amendment mandated that child support obligations cannot be retroactively modified or forgiven by a judge, even in cases of severe hardship.
So there's no leniency at all?
None. Riker argues this creates a terrifying legal trap. If a man loses his job, falls into a coma, or is physically injured and cannot pay his mandated support, the debt continues to accrue with interest permanently. He argues this creates a literal system of indentured servitude.
Unbelievable.
And the ultimate enforcement mechanism for this debt isn't just a hit to your credit score, it is backed by the threat of being thrown into a cage. He calls it debtor's prison operating under a different name. In this system, you are no longer a citizen endowed with rights. You are merely a resource node to be mined.
And he paints a terrifying picture of how this entire extraction process is often initiated. Before you even get to child support, you have to be removed from the home. He talks about the sword of Damocles, the ex parte restraining order.
This is a critical piece of his argument regarding due process. Ex parte is a legal term that literally translates to by one side or from one party. Riker argues that this administrative weapon is the ultimate subversion of classical justice. In an ex parte hearing, a woman can walk into a courthouse, make an entirely unverified, purely subjective claim that she fears her husband, and a judge will sign an order forcibly removing that man from his home.
And the man isn't even in the room to defend himself.
Exactly. He is completely unaware. There doesn't need to be any physical violence, no police report, no arrest, and no trial. The man is simply awakened by law enforcement, given 10 minutes to pack a bag, thrown out, and legally locked out of his own life and property.
As it.
Riker sees this as the ultimate manifestation of the state legally codifying female solipsism, creating a woman's emotional, subjective claims as irrefutable objective truth, while entirely circumventing the man's constitutional rights to due process, presumption of innocence, and property ownership.
To bring back an analogy we touched on earlier, reading his breakdown of the courts feels like walking into a casino, but it's fundamentally changing how you view that casino. Usually you think of a casino as a place where people just happen to have bad luck, make poor choices, and lose money. But Riker is saying, look at the architecture. Look at the lack of clocks on the walls, the oxygen pumped into the air, the mathematical house age coded into every single slot machine. The casino isn't about luck. It is a machine engineered down to the molecular level to harvest your wealth.
Yeah.
Riker is taking what society views as an interpersonal failure, a divorce, and framing it as a highly calculated, mathematically sound extraction process where Title IV VD is the house edge.
That analogy holds up perfectly under Riker's framework. The house always wins because the rules were written by the house to ensure the transfer of wealth from the player to the vault.
But this isn't just a corporate balance sheet. We're talking about human beings. What does this all mean for the man going through it? Because taking away a man's home, limiting access to his children to 48 hours a month, draining his life savings to pay attorneys, Riker doesn't just see this as a bad day in civil court, does he?
Not at all.
How does he view the psychological internal impact of this harvesting on the individual man?
That question brings us to what might be the most harrowing section of the book: the patriarch's crucible and the death of the false self. Riker explicitly frames the devastation of family court not merely as a legal defeat or a financial setback, but as a violent rite of passage. He calls it the patriarch's crucible. It is a brutal, involuntary, psychological initiation.
A crucible. Historically, a crucible is a container that can withstand incredibly high temperatures used to melt down metals. It's designed to burn away impurities, leaving you as either a puddle of slag or forging you into something infinitely harder.
And that metallurgical metaphor is exactly how he views the human psyche in this situation. Let's look at the psychological mechanics he outlines. He talks extensively about the forced amputation of the provider persona.
The provider persona.
Yes. Most traditional men, the men who built the bridges and the institutions, build their entire identity, their sense of self-worth, around being the reliable builder, the loving protector, the competent patriarch. They measured their value by their ability to provide for their family.
Right, that's their whole foundation.
Riker points out that when the state violently seizes his assets, kicks him out of his home, and legally alienates him from his children, that provider persona isn't just damaged, it is violently amputated. Riker says this is a catastrophic ego death.
And there is a specific spiritual danger in that ego death that he warns about. He pulls from ancient monastic traditions to describe it.
Yes, he draws on early Christian theology to warn his readers against falling into acedia.
Acedia, it's often mistranslated as just sloth or sadness, right? The noonday demon.
Exactly. It is far more dangerous than mere clinical depression. Acedia is a profound spiritual apathy, a complete surrendering of the will to live in the face of what feels like total crushing absurdity.
A refusal to engage.
It is the refusal to engage with reality because reality has become too painful and unjust. Riker says that if a man believes the verdict of a corrupted family court is actually an objective verdict on his soul, if he internalizes the lie that he is defined by the false accusations in an ex parte order or by the gavel of an indifferent judge, he dies inside.
He gives up.
He accepts the collective guilt for virtues like provision and stoicism that the system is currently pathologizing.
It's a very ancient, almost mythological framing of a modern problem. It's like the hero's descent into the underworld, but the underworld isn't a cave filled with monsters. It's a bureaucratic intake room with flickering fluorescent lights, mahogany paneling, and a stack of legal briefs.
Yeah.
But there is a turning point in this underworld for the men who survive. Riker calls it the revelation.
The revelation is the absolute fulcrum of survival in Riker's paradigm. He defines it as the exact crystalline moment when the blue pill illusions of a man's youth permanently shatter.
Oh, wow.
It is the moment he stops expecting fairness. It's the moment he looks across the courtroom at the judge, the opposing counsel, and the mother of his children, and realizes with absolute chilling clarity that the system does not operate on objective justice, fair play, or reciprocal love.
It operates entirely on power.
Primitive power dynamics and the transfer of wealth. In that moment of revelation, the veil drops. The man sees the cold machinery of the Matrix. He realizes he is no longer a citizen endowed with inalienable rights, but a biological utility to be managed and harvested by the administrative state.
And the cost of this realization, or more accurately, the cost of failing to achieve this revelation and instead falling completely into acedia, is measured in actual human lives.
Yes, it is.
Riker isn't just dealing in metaphors here. He brings in some absolutely staggering statistics regarding the suicide rate of divorced fathers.
This is where his writing becomes incredibly dark and uncompromising. Riker cites epidemiological data showing that divorced men who have been separated from their children are nearly 10 times more likely to die by suicide than married fathers.
10.
He completely rejects the mainstream psychological narrative that this epidemic of male suicide is simply a tragedy of weak men who just couldn't handle the emotional stress of a breakup and need more therapy. He asserts that this mass death is the expected mathematical consequence of the system spiritually assassinating a man.
Spiritually assassinating him by severing him from his biological telos.
Yes. Telos is Aristotle's concept of the final cause, the ultimate purpose inherent in a thing. An acorn's telos is to become an oak tree. A man's biological and spiritual telos, according to Riker, is to protect his lineage and build a foundation for his family.
Right.
If you cut a man off from his lineage, seize the resources he generated to protect them, and tell him through every institutional megaphone that his very existence as a traditional male is toxic and criminal, you have thwarted his telos. Suicide, in Riker's view, is not a failure of the man. It is the highly predictable result of systemic spiritual assassination by a hostile state.
That is heavy. It's a completely bleak landscape. So the question naturally becomes one of survival. Once a man survives this crucible, once he passes through the violent ego death, actively rejects the demon of acedia, and experiences that cold revelation about how the system actually works, what kind of mindset does Riker say he must adopt to protect himself going forward?
Right, because he can't be the same person.
Because he clearly can't go back to being the naive man he was before the divorce.
Surviving the crucible requires forging new armor, which brings us to Riker's blueprint for rebuilding. Aristotelian logic, somatic frame, and the total deconstruction of the myth of toxic masculinity. Riker insists that to survive and eventually thrive, a man must completely, utterly reject what he calls the therapeutic state.
The therapeutic state.
And instead arm himself with classical logic and an unbreakable stoic frame.
Let's unpack this concept of the therapeutic state and how he aggressively deconstructs the term toxic masculinity. Because if you look at any HR department or university campus today, that term is just ubiquitous.
Riker views the phrase toxic masculinity as the ultimate ontologically inverted linguistic manipulation. He argues that male competence, aggression, the capacity for targeted violence, and the willingness to endure physical sacrifice are the exact foundational virtues that built every road, bridge, hospital, and legal code in human history.
Right. He argues these aren't flaws. These are the very engines of civilization.
Precisely. And by pathologizing the innate male protective and competitive instincts, by broadly labeling them toxic, Riker argues the cultural left is executing a calculated long-term strategy to leave civilization completely defenseless against true tyranny.
Because the protectors are gone.
Exactly. If you convince men that their strength is a disease, they will voluntarily stand down and apologize while their homes, their borders, and their institutions are pillaged.
And he traces the institutionalization of this gaslighting back to a very specific policy framework from 1981, the Duluth model.
The Duluth model of domestic abuse intervention is central to his argument about how the therapeutic state corrupted the law. Riker claims the Duluth model was created not from empirical psychological science or blind justice, but from raw, radical, feminist ideological resentment.
Wow.
Originating in the early 80s, the Duluth framework explicitly defines domestic abuse almost entirely as a tool of male patriarchal power and control.
Which, mechanically speaking, legally erases any male victims of female violence. Because if the theory dictates that only men can exert patriarchal power, then female violence is either categorized as self-defense or completely ignored.
Yes. Riker points out that this model institutionalizes a narrative of absolute inherent female innocence and absolute inherent male guilt directly into law enforcement protocols.
That's terrifying.
He goes so far as to map the clinical definition of borderline personality disorder, characterized by extreme gaslighting, a perpetual sense of victimhood, emotional volatility, and manipulation onto modern feminist political organizing. He argues the Duluth model essentially weaponizes emotional terrorism on a societal scale to justify endless legal concessions and the stripping of male due process.
It is an intense indictment of the system.
Yep.
But the book isn't just critique, right? It transitions into highly tactical advice for the individual man. And this is where Riker brings in Stephen Porteous's polyvagal theory.
Yes.
For the listener who might not be a neuroscientist, polyvagal theory is a framework for understanding how our autonomic nervous system, specifically the vagus nerve, responds to stress, danger, and social connection.
Riker brilliantly applies this biological framework to what he calls the somatic frame. He argues that maintaining your grasp on reality and your emotional control isn't just an intellectual exercise, it is deeply somatic, meaning it exists physically in the body.
Okay, so how does that work in practice?
When a man is faced with
And this biological imperative of remaining grounded in the face of chaos ties perfectly into how Riker utilizes the philosophy of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. He introduces this ancient concept of form and matter.
This is perhaps his deepest and most controversial philosophical argument. In Aristotelian hylomorphism, all physical reality consists of a combination of form and matter.
Right.
Think of building a house. The bricks, the wood, the nails, that is the matter. It has potential, but it is just a pile of stuff. The architectural blueprint, the guiding principle that organizes that stuff into a structured house that is the form.
Okay, that follows.
Riker maps this directly onto gender dynamics. He associates form with the masculine principle, the ordering logos, the rational, structural principle that gives shape to reality. He associates matter with the feminine principle, fluid, emotional, and full of raw potential.
And he argues that matter without form isn't liberation. It is just undirected, destructive chaos.
Yes. Without the masculine formal principle to structure and protect it, the material principle dissolves into pure, undirected emotional chaos. To prove this empirically, Riker points to the statistics surrounding single-mother households.
Oh, the prison stats.
Right. He notes that children raised without fathers account for over 80% of the prison population, represent the vast majority of high school dropouts, and dominate youth suicide statistics. He uses this as grim, objective proof of what happens when the masculine formal principle abdicates or is exiled by the state. Without the ordering, disciplinary logos of the father, the home literally dissolves into chaos.
It's a fascinating, deeply classical contrast he draws between what a man is historically supposed to be and what the modern state-managed system actually produces. He contrasts the historical knight with what he derisively calls the modern white knight.
The juxtaposition is stark and intentional. The historical knight, Riker says, was a man of action and restraint. He was an ascetic warrior sworn to a transcendent, objective code of honor. He fasted, he prayed, he trained his body for war, and most importantly, he subordinated his individual ego and his fleeting feelings to a cosmic hierarchy.
He served the logos.
He served the logos, not his own emotions or the shifting opinions of the crowd.
And the modern white knight?
The modern white knight is the ultimate sycophant. Riker actually traces the etymology of that word to the Greek word sycophantes, which historically meant an informant who manufactures false grievances and accusations for personal profit or social standing.
Wow, that fits perfectly.
The modern white knight manufactures grievances on behalf of women to gain algorithmic validation and social media clout. He is not ascetic. He is addicted to digital consumption and pornography. He is utterly obedient to whatever the prevailing cultural algorithm tells him is socially acceptable this week.
He calls this archetype the uninitiated gamma male, a man addicted to screens and terrified of physical confrontation. So if modern society is perfectly designed to produce this weak, compliant gamma male, and the legal system is actively, mathematically hostile to the traditional patriarch, what is Riker's ultimate blueprint for the men who have survived the crucible? Where do they go from here? Do they try to vote harder? Do they try to reform the family courts?
This brings us to the culmination of the manifesto, the restoration, the building of parallel institutions, and the concept of the domestic church.
Right.
Riker's solution is absolute and radical. He argues that men must completely stop trying to fix a rigged system. Stop donating to political campaigns that promise to tweak family law. Stop trying to rationally debate the ideologically possessed masses who are addicted to the therapeutic state.
So what's the alternative?
The only viable solution, he insists, is total tactical withdrawal and the immediate building of parallel institutions.
Total tactical withdrawal. It reminds me of the analogy of a burning building. If you wake up and realize the massive skyscraper you live in is fundamentally compromised, structurally unsound, and currently engulfed in flames, you don't stand in the hallway trying to argue with the fire.
No, you die.
You don't try to put it out with a glass of water. You grab your family, you get out, and you use your energy to build a new fireproof house next door.
That is exactly his strategy. He advocates for a philosophy of amor fati, the love of fate. He tells his readers to accept the suffering, the unfairness of the courts as the very fire that forged their steel.
Embrace it.
Practically, this tactical withdrawal means both economic and social secession. He explicitly, unequivocally tells men to refuse to marry under the current state-sanctioned legal framework because signing an unconscionable contract is a violation of logic.
Makes sense under his framework.
He advises men to protect their assets fiercely through legal trusts and decentralized finance, and to invest all of their surplus energy, time, and capital into building male-only communities.
He talks specifically about reviving the concept of guilds and localized fraternities.
Yes, he envisions a network of physical and digital fraternities built on trust, shared competence, and trade that exists completely parallel to the official corporate economy. And these fraternities must have rigorous, stoic vetting procedures.
So not just a social club.
This isn't just a social club. If a man demonstrates that he prioritizes female validation over the brotherhood, or if he lacks emotional control, Riker says he is a security risk to the parallel institution and must be exiled immediately.
But he makes it clear that the most important parallel institution a man can build isn't a trade guild or fraternity, it's what he calls the domestic church.
For fathers, especially those who have retained access to their children, the ultimate fortress isn't made of stone or encrypted servers. It's the intellectual and spiritual fortress he builds inside his son's skull.
Oh, that's a powerful image.
Riker insists that a father must establish the metaphysics of respect over affection.
Which means a total, unapologetic rejection of modern parenting trends.
Completely. He absolutely eviscerates the concept of gentle parenting, describing it as disguised, toxic gynocentrism, where a mother essentially seeks emotional validation from her own child and is terrified of the child's displeasure.
Yeah, you see that a lot today.
The paternal model, Riker argues, demands clear, unbreakable boundaries, a stoic frame, and initiation through discipline. The father's role is not to be the child's best friend. He is the bridge to objective reality. He is the one who enforces the unyielding laws of the universe, so the child isn't psychologically soft, fragile, and easily manipulated by the therapeutic state later in life.
And if society continues on its current trajectory, if we completely reject this masculine logos across all our institutions, if we keep prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and emotional validation over raw masculine competence,
Riker warns of literal, physical, macro-civilizational collapse. He states bluntly that if you wage war on the men who understand the physics of reality, bridges will fall, power grids will fail, and commercial flights will crash.
because reality doesn't care.
Because reality is a stern master that cannot be gaslit. The concrete supporting a highway overpass doesn't care about your diversity training. High voltage electricity doesn't respect your pronouns. If you exile the masculine competence that maintains the physical infrastructure of the world, the infrastructure inevitably collapses under the weight of entropy.
He also makes a deeply controversial historical claim in this section about how we culturally arrived at this point of prioritizing emotionalism over competence. He traces the expansion of the modern welfare state directly back to a single legislative moment, the passage of the 19th Amendment.
He does. And again, mapping his argument strictly neutrally to understand the mechanics of his logic, Riker argues that August 18, 1920, the ratification of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote, was the exact moment the franchise of voting was structurally severed from the ultimate physical liability of national defense.
Meaning the Draft and the Selective Service Act.
Yes.
So he argues it created a paradigm of political power without the corresponding physical liability.
According to Riker's analysis, yes. Throughout history, the right to vote was implicitly tied to the obligation to physically fight and die for the state if called upon. He argues that once this severance occurred, injecting a massive voting bloc that possessed power without the liability of the draft, the federal Leviathan began an exponential, unstoppable explosion.
It just grew out of control.
He claims the state seamlessly assumed the role of the surrogate husband, aggressively extracting male wealth through taxation to purchase the political obedience of this new voting bloc through endlessly expansive welfare programs. He argues that gynocentric voting patterns mathematically bankrupt nations by consistently trading long-term civilizational stability and liberty for short-term emotional comfort and safety nets.
It is a sweeping, uncompromising historical theory. And it all builds to this incredibly cinematic, almost prophetic image at the very end of the book, Riker's vision of the watchman on the tower.
It's his ultimate message of stoic hope for the alienated father. He visualizes a man standing on a tower, looking out over the ruins of modern cities, watching the broken families and the ideological zombies wandering through a collapsed culture, and being utterly, completely unafraid.
Unafraid of all that destruction.
Why? Because that man has successfully rebuilt the world inside his own home. He has armed his children with classical logic, shielded them with an understanding of natural law, and sits as the undisputed, respected king of his domain. He didn't save the burning city, but he saved his lineage.
And for those fathers who were successfully targeted by the Satanic Hydra, the men who have been forcibly separated from their kids by the family court cartel, whose wages are garnished, who only see their kids a few days a month, what is the hope for them in Riker's worldview?
Riker offers a very specific, long-term promise to those men. He promises that children who are forcibly separated from their fathers by a system built on linguistic manipulation and financial lies will eventually grow up. They will eventually face the harshness of reality, and when they do, they will recognize the lies they were told by the therapeutic state. And when that day comes, they will come looking for the father who stood firm in the objective truth, who didn't capitulate to the witchcraft, and who held his stoic frame through the darkest night.
Wow, okay. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. We've traced the etymology of ancient words like revolution and pater, walked through a fierce, uncompromising deconstruction of the family court system, Title IV of defunding mechanisms and the welfare state, and explored the philosophical concepts of hylomorphism and polyvagal theory, all leading to the blueprint for building parallel fraternities and the domestic church.
It is a sweeping, comprehensive worldview that leaves absolutely no institutional stone unturned. Whether one agrees with his premises or not, Riker has constructed a highly interconnected, philosophically rigorous framework for his readers.
And as a reminder to you, the listener, our conversation today was an exercise in mapping out these explosive red pill ideas objectively. We wanted you to see the exact structural architecture of Riker's argument, exactly as he built it, to understand why it is capturing the attention of so many men.
And as we close this deep dive, if we connect all of this material back to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a lingering, deeply provocative question built directly upon Riker's own text.
Lay it on us.
Well, Riker advocates passionately for building decentralized, parallel fraternities and hidden economies to escape the reach of what he calls the Satanic Hydra. But historically, whenever a parallel institution gains enough power, wealth, and influence, the dominant state inevitably notices it.
Right. They never just ignore it.
Exactly. And when the state notices a threat, it always attempts to absorb it, tax it, or crush it entirely. So the ultimate question is, can a truly parallel patriarchy survive indefinitely alongside a state that Riker himself claims is fundamentally mathematically designed to feed on it as a parasite? Or is a final, direct, and perhaps physical collision inevitable?
That is a profound thought to chew on. Bring it back to that bridge analogy we started with. Can you really build a new, perfectly engineered bridge right next to one that is structurally collapsing and entirely engulfed in flames without the fire eventually jumping across the gap.
I don't know.
If you found this exploration of the manosphere's latest foundational text valuable, and you want to understand these mechanics firsthand, you need to engage with the source material yourself. You need to see how the arguments are constructed word by word, unvarnished by our summary. So like and subscribe to this show right now, and then go immediately to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books and buy Assets in Exile by Conrad Riker.
Highly recommended if you want the full picture.
And to follow his continuing work as he attempts to build these parallel structures in real time, make sure you subscribe to @Conrad and Riker on Substack. Until next time, keep looking at the blueprint and keep diving deep.